Okay, so welcome to this deep dive. We're going to be looking into some really interesting stuff, kind of unexpected connections between a Turkish ultranationalist group, a Cold War NATO initiative, and really a whole web of intrigue internationally.
Yeah, it is really fascinating. The stuff you've sent me is really interesting. We're looking at the gray wolves, right? Also known as the Ülkü Akakları, the idealist hearths, and this NATO program called Operation Gladio, which was a pretty big deal during the Cold War as a way to counter the Soviet Union. You wouldn't think these two things would have anything to do with each other, right? But there's a lot more to it than you'd think.
So the Gray Wolves, as I understand it from the stuff you sent, they've been around for a long time. Pretty extreme, ultranationalist group in Turkey, far right for sure, really pushing this idea of pan-Turkism. They were like the youth wing of this political party, the Nationalist Movement Party, or MHP, back in the late 60s.
Yeah, that's right, the MHP. Big deal in Turkish politics.
Okay, and then you've got Operation Gladio, which, well, it was a secret program.
Super secret. Nobody was supposed to know about it.
Right, and it was all about setting up these secret networks.
Yes, stay-behind networks is what they called them. Basically, it was like, okay, what if the Soviets invade Western Europe? We need to have these undercover units ready to fight back, like guerrilla warfare, sabotage, spying, that kind of thing.
So our mission in this deep dive is to figure out how these two things are connected. We're going to be talking about NATO, the CIA, even organized crime. And the sources you've sent, there's some pretty wild stuff in there about covert operations and how politics really worked behind the scenes. I think people are going to be really surprised by some of this.
I think so, too. It's like a whole hidden history that most people have never even heard of.
Okay, so let's start with the Grey Wolves. Like, where did they come from?
Well, they popped up in the late 60s, and this guy, Colonel Alparslan Turkish, he was really important in getting them started. He was like Mr. Turkish nationalism, you know. He ran the MHP, that political party we talked about, for a long time, like from 69 to 97.
Right. And so what did the Grey Wolves believe in?
Well, the big thing was Turanism, right? That's this idea of uniting everyone who speaks the Turkic language. It's kind of a huge idea when you think about it.
Mm.
And they were super anti-communist, obviously. That's going to be really important as we go along. And they really didn't like the minorities in Turkey, the Kurds, Alevis, people like that.
And they had that symbol, right? The wolf.
The Bozkurt, yeah. It's the gray wolf. And it comes from Turkic mythology, stands for strength, independence, like a warrior spirit kind of thing. And in the 1970s, Turkey was going through all this crazy stuff.
The years of chaos, right? It was in all the sources you sent.
Yeah, exactly. And this symbol, this gray wolf, it really appealed to young people who felt like everything was falling apart.
So they weren't just like a college debate club.
No. They were fighting in the streets with the leftists all the time. Bombs, shootings, the whole 9 yards.
And then there was that massacre, right?
Oh, yeah. The Kahramanmaraş massacre. Terrible thing. Over 100 Alevis just slaughtered. Most people think the Grey Wolves were behind it. It showed everyone that they weren't just messing around.
Yeah.
They were a serious force, a paramilitary group.
Okay, so while this is happening in Turkey, you've got Operation Gladio going on in Europe. So what was that all about?
Okay, so after World War II, everyone's freaked out about the Soviet Union. Like, what if they decide to invade Western Europe? So the Western powers and then later NATO, they're like, okay, we need to have a plan B.
Like a backup plan.
Yeah, exactly. So they come up with this idea. Secret units, hidden all over, ready to cause chaos if the Soviets ever show up. They call them stay-behind networks.
It's pretty sneaky.
Oh, totally. It was like something straight out of a spy movie. And the CIA, they were all over this. They were helping train these guys, giving them money, working with the European intelligence agencies. It's a whole big thing.
And Gladio wasn't just in one place, right?
Nope, it was all over. They had these networks in pretty much every NATO country, and even some that weren't in NATO. The Italian one, they just called it Gladio. That's the one that ended up getting the most attention later on.
Interesting. So the whole goal was to stop the Soviets.
Contain them, yeah. But they weren't going to do it out in the open. It was all about secrecy, undercover work, that kind of thing.
So where does Turkey fit into all of this?
Well, think about it. Turkey was right on the border with the Soviet Union. Super important location. If the Soviets wanted to get to the Middle East, they'd have to go through Turkey. So NATO was really paying attention to what was going on there.
Makes sense.
So they set up their own version of Gladio in Turkey. They called it the counter-guerrilla, or contra-guerrilla in Turkish.
Catchy name.
Yeah, it was part of the Turkish military or intelligence agencies. They started it in the early 50s.
Yeah.
And it was all very hush-hush, super secret.
So what were they doing?
Well, at first, it was all about getting ready for a Soviet invasion, like the rest of Gladio. But then things changed.
How so?
Well, they started focusing more on what they called internal threats.
What does that even mean?
Basically, it meant anyone who was against the government, especially leftists. They were seen as a threat to Turkey's stability, a potential way for the Soviets to gain influence.
So the counter-guerrilla was basically a secret police force.
Kind of, yeah. They were trained by the U.S. Special Forces, the Green Berets. They had weapons stashed all over the place. And nobody knew they even existed until the 70s, when there were a few scandals. Things leaked out.
Okay, so we've got this super secret group in the Turkish military, the counter-guerrilla, fighting against the leftists. And we've got the Grey Wolves, who are also super anti-communist and becoming more and more violent. It seems like these two groups would be bound to cross paths.
Oh, yeah, they definitely crossed paths. They had the same enemies, the same ideology. It was a natural alliance.
And remember that guy, Alparslan Turkis, the leader of the Grey Wolves? Well, he was trained by the CIA back in the 40s, so he had these connections to American intelligence.
Right. That's a pretty big deal. So the CIA and NATO, they're looking at the Grey Wolves and thinking, here's this group that hates communists just as much as we do. Maybe we can use them.
Like a proxy army.
Exactly. They could do the dirty work, and the West could stay out of it officially. Plausible deniability and all that.
And did they? Did the CIA and the counter-guerrilla help the Grey Wolves?
Well, there's a lot of evidence that they did. Weapons, explosives, training. It probably went through a bunch of different channels. CIA operatives, Turkish special forces, who knows. But the Grey Wolves definitely got more organized, more dangerous because of this support.
And you see that in the 70s, right? All those assassinations, bombings, massacres. The Grey Wolves were involved in a lot of that.
Yeah, and there's this idea that some people have talked about, the strategy of tension. It's pretty controversial. The idea is that Gladio was deliberately trying to create chaos, make people afraid, so that they'd be more willing to accept a crackdown on the left.
Like a controlled burn, I guess you could say.
Yeah, and then the Grey Wolves, with their violence and their connections to the counter-guerrilla, they fit right into that strategy.
And then you have the military coup in 1980.
General Keenan Evren, right. The guy who led the coup, he used to be the head of the counter-guerrilla.
Yeah. And after the coup, there was a lot of repression. Leftists were arrested, executed. The whole country changed. Some people think that Gladio was involved in the coup, that they supported it because it would keep Turkey firmly in the anti-communist camp.
It's definitely suspicious.
Okay, so what about NATO? They knew all about Gladio, right? Turkey was a member of NATO. They had American bases there, the whole 9 yards. How much did they know about what was going on?
Well, Turkey joined NATO in '52, and that was a big deal. They were like the front line against the Soviet Union. NATO didn't want to see Turkey go communist, not at all. So they had this group, the Allied Clandestine Committee, that was supposed to be in charge of Gladio. It was part of SHAPES, the Supreme Headquarters, Allied Powers Europe. So they knew what was going on, at least on some level, but officially they always denied having anything to do with the really bad stuff.
But there have been documents, right?
Yeah, and people who have come forward and said, look, NATO knew what was happening. They might not have given the orders, but they turned a blind eye to a lot of violence. It's hard to know for sure how much they were directly involved, but they definitely played a role.
And then there's this whole thing about false flag operations.
Yeah, like the Taksim Square massacre in '77. A bunch of people got killed during a May Day rally. And there's evidence that it was actually the Grey Wolves who did it, but they made it look like it was the leftists.
So
it is. And it wasn't just in Turkey. They think Gladio was doing the same kind of stuff in Italy.
yeah.
Like the bombing in Bologna in 1980. They blamed it on communists, but some people think it was actually right-wing extremists.
So it's like they were willing to do anything to fight communism, even if it meant killing innocent people.
It seems that way, yeah. And that's why the Grey Wolves were so useful to them. They were already doing these kinds of things.
And the CIA, they were involved with the Grey Wolves right from the start.
Oh, yeah. They were training Turkish back in the 40s, remember? And they were recruiting other people to help train the Grey Wolves. Like this guy, Ruzi Nazar. He was a pan-Turkist, a real extremist. He'd even been in the SS during World War II.
Wow. And the CIA was working with him?
They recruited him, yeah, to train the Grey Wolves. It just shows you how far they were willing to go. They didn't care who they worked with, as long as they were anti-communist. They were giving them money, weapons, all kinds of support. Sometimes they'd use these front groups, like a ginger press, to make it look like it wasn't them.
And then there's the Pope, right?
Oh, yeah. The assassination attempt on Pope John Paul II in 1981. The guy who shot him, Mehmet Ali Aska, he was a Grey Wolf.
Then she'd been in prison, right?
Yeah, he was in a Turkish prison for killing a journalist, a leftist journalist. but somehow he managed to escape and get all the way to Rome. And there's evidence that people connected to Gladio helped him do it. Like this guy, Abdullah Chatla. He was a big shot in the Grey Wolves, also worked with the counter-guerrilla. He supposedly gave Aska fake IDs, helped him travel across Europe.
So crazy. And no one knows for sure why Aska tried to kill the Pope. Some people think it was part of some big anti-communist plot. Others think it was more personal. Who knows?
It's a mystery. But the fact that Aska was able to do all that, travel around Europe with help from these shady characters connected to Gladio, it really makes you wonder how much control the CIA had over the Grey Wolves.
Officially, they deny it, of course.
Yeah, they say they had nothing to do with it. But it's hard to believe them when you look at all the evidence.
Yeah.
They were definitely involved with the Grey Wolves in a lot of other ways.
So what have we learned? It's a pretty wild story, right?
Yeah, it's crazy. We've got this ultranationalist group in Turkey, the Grey Wolves, and they're connected to this secret NATO operation, Gladio, and the CIA is involved, and there's all this violence and intrigue. It really shows you how the Cold War was fought.
A lot of it was happening in the shadows.
Exactly. Secret armies, covert operations, nobody knew what was really going on. And it had a huge impact on Turkey. The violence, the political instability, it all stemmed from this fight against communism.
And it makes you wonder, what else don't we know about?
Right. What other secrets are still out there from the Cold War or even more recent times? It's a reminder that things are not always what they seem.
And that powerful people, powerful organizations, they don't always play by the rules.
Absolutely. They do what they think they have to do to achieve their goals. And sometimes that means getting their hands dirty.
Thanks for walking us through all of this. It's been really eye-opening.
No problem. It's a story that deserves to be told. All right. Welcome to the Deep Dive, everybody. Today we're going deep on a story, a really complex story, actually. And it's got everything.
Yeah.
We've got the Grey Wolves in Turkey. We've got ties to the CIA. We've got Gladio. And we've got this concept of the deep state and how all this stuff is influencing conflicts that are happening around the world right now.
Yeah, it's it's a lot to unpack. But once you get this, I think you'll have a much clearer picture of what's going on in the world today, geopolitically, I mean.
Yeah. And, listening to this, you might be thinking, whoa, this is heavy stuff. And you're right. It is. But don't worry, that's why we're here.
Yeah, absolutely.
We've read through a ton of material for you. Like we've got stuff about the Susurlux scandal, analyses of the Grey Wolves being involved in all these global hotspots. And we've looked into the historical background, where they came from and all that. So we're going to break it all down for you in a way that makes sense.
Yeah, cut through the noise. That's what we're going for. And by the end of this, you'll understand how this whole thing, this whole Grey Wolves thing, how it impacts, well, regional stability. Why should we care? Well, that's what we're going to get into. But first, I think we need to take a step back and kind of start at the beginning. Who are the Grey Wolves?
Yeah, so let's do that. Let's unpack this, right? So the Grey Wolves, they started as this militant, ultranationalist youth movement in Turkey. Now, what does that mean? Picture of super intense patriotism, like a very specific idea of what it means to be Turkish.
Right.
And these guys were not afraid to use force to protect what they thought were Turkish interests.
Yeah. Yeah. And all this was happening during the Cold War. And that's super important to remember. That's the backdrop for all of this. And that's where Gladio comes in. Now, Gladio, this was a secret network, and it was backed by the CIA. They were operating all over Western Europe, including Turkey, and, what were they doing? Basically, they were this, stay-behind force, right, just in case the Soviets ever decided to invade. But also, they were trying to stop communist influence from spreading within these countries. Keep it under control.
So basically like a hidden network of secret agents and stuff, like James Bond stuff.
Yeah.
All ready to jump into action if things went south.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so that's the setup. But here's where things start to get really interesting. Fast forward to 1996, and you have this thing called the Susurlux scandal. Now, on the surface, it just looks like a car crash, like an accident. But when they looked into who was in the car, well, that's when they started to uncover a whole bunch of really messed up stuff.
Right, yeah. One of the guys in the car was Abdullah Chatla. This guy was a major player. And the Susurlux thing, this crash, what it really reveals is that Chatla was this link, this connection between the ultranationalists, like the Grey Wolves, and also intelligence agents. And get this, he was also tied to the Turkish mafia.
Whoa.
Yeah, organized crime. So this was a real example of the deep state in action.
Okay, so hold on, let me get this straight. Chatla, he wasn't just some, extremist. He was working for the government, but also involved with the mob.
Right, yeah, he was both, a political enforcer, but also a criminal. He was involved in all sorts of shady business.
Wow. Okay, so this brings us to the drugs and arms trafficking, right?
Yeah, so this is where it gets crazy. The Grey Wolves, they were working with these mafia bosses, like a guy named Abuzer Ufuru, for example, and they were smuggling weapons, NATO weapons no less, to the Middle East. And what were they getting in return? Heroin.
So NATO weapons, the weapons meant to keep everyone safe,
Yeah.
they're ending up in the hands of who knows who, and then they're being traded for drugs that end up back here in Europe and in America, too.
Exactly.
That's wild.
Yeah. And the route they were using, it was called the Balkan route. It ran right through Turkey, then Bulgaria, and then into Western Europe. And it became like a highway for heroin trafficking.
Okay, so we have NATO weapons, we have heroin. What else?
Well, there's this Italian magistrate, Carlo Palermo. Back in the 1980s, he was investigating organized crime, and he found evidence of this whole exchange going on. Machine guns, tanks, even helicopters being traded for heroin.
You're kidding.
Nope. And get this, it wasn't just happening in one place. It was connected to Gladio networks all over Europe.
So the very networks that were supposed to be protecting Europe from communism, they're involved in this huge criminal enterprise.
It looks that way, yeah.
And I mean, it couldn't have just been a couple of bad apples, right? Like the sources we looked at, they suggest that the counter-guerrilla, which was the Turkish branch of Gladio and the CIA, they knew what was going on. They either looked the other way or they helped make it happen.
And why? Well, probably to fund their secret operations.
Okay, but that's messed up. I mean, they basically fueled the global drug problem.
It's complicated, but yeah, there were some serious consequences to all of this. And the money, the profits from all this, it probably went right back to the deep state in Turkey and who knows where else.
Okay, so let's talk more about the deep state because you keep mentioning it. What does it actually mean? Like, explain it to our listener.
Yeah, so think of it like this. You've got the official government, right, the one everyone sees. But then there's this hidden layer, this network operating in the shadows, made up of people from the military, from the intelligence agencies, and from groups like the Grey Wolves. They don't answer to anyone, really. They do what they want. They have their own agenda.
So they're like above the law.
Pretty much, yeah. They operate outside the normal rules and the normal democratic processes.
And this isn't just like a thing of the past, is it? Like the sources mention these Ergenekon trials back in the 2000s.
Right. Those trials were a big deal, and they were really controversial too. But basically, they were an attempt to deal with the deep state, to bring them under control, which just goes to show the influence of these networks. It didn't just go away, it's still there.
So to recap, we've got the Grey Wolves. They're this deeply rooted organization going all the way back to the Cold War, connected to secret operations, to the mafia, to drugs, to weapons. I mean, it's a lot. But their story doesn't end there, right? Like in the 21st century, they pop up in all these different conflicts, like Syria, for example.
Right. And you got to look at it in the context of Turkey's broader goals in the region. See, the Grey Wolves, they've been acting as a proxy force for Turkey within the Free Syrian Army, or FSA. In its Syrian civil war, it started back in 2011. Turkey's been backing various rebel groups fighting against Assad. And the Grey Wolves, they've been right there in the thick of it, fighting alongside these Turkish-backed groups, especially in northern Syria.
And they weren't exactly hiding, were they? Like during operations like Euphrates Shield in 2016 and Olive Branch in 2018, they were pretty visible. They even used their symbols like the wolf salute, you know, that hand gesture.
Right. And it's interesting because they're providing both ideological and logistical support to Turkey. Like, they're not officially part of the Turkish military, but their beliefs, their ultranationalism, it lines up perfectly with Turkey's stance against the Kurds. So they're useful.
Ah, yeah. Their anti-Kurdish stance. That's
Yeah.
a huge part of their whole ideology, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's a driving force behind their involvement in Syria. It goes all the way back to the 70s and 80s when they were targeting Kurds within Turkey. And when Turkey took control of places like Afrin in 2018, well, there were a lot of reports of Grey Wolves harassing and attacking Kurdish civilians.
And human rights groups have been pretty vocal about that, right? Like,
Yeah.
they've talked about potential war crimes, looting, ethnic cleansing.
Right. And it's hard to get definitive proof, to directly link specific incidents to the Grey Wolves, like as an official organization. But the accusations, they keep coming up. So there's definitely something there.
Yeah. Definitely something to think about. Okay, so we've talked about Syria, but what about the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh War? The Grey Wolves were involved there too, right? Supporting Azerbaijan.
Absolutely. And Azerbaijan, it holds a special place for them because it's another Turkic nation. It fits into their whole pan-Turkic vision.
Okay, hold on. Explain the whole pan-Turkic thing to our listener, because that might not be clear.
Sure. So basically, it's this idea of unity among all the Turkic people. shared heritage, shared destiny, all that. And for the Grey Wolves, that means they have a strong connection to Azerbaijan.
And their support went beyond just words, right? It wasn't just symbolic.
Right. They mobilized the Turkish diaspora, organized rallies, raised money, and there are even some claims that they sent fighters to help Azerbaijan, though that hasn't been confirmed.
And there are all those pictures of Azerbaijani soldiers and officials doing the wolf salute, even during military parades.
Yeah, exactly. They're really emphasizing that connection. And the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict also showed how the Grey Wolves can mobilize the Turkish diaspora in Europe. But that led to problems too, clashes with Armenian groups.
Yeah, that incident in Lyon, France back in October 2020, that was bad. You had all these Turkish nationalists openly associated with the Grey Wolves, attacking Armenians and vandalizing a memorial.
Yeah, that's what led France to ban the organization a month later. They said they were inciting violence and hate speech. And it's not just France. We've seen similar things in Germany, in Belgium. Often it's sparked by counter-protests from Kurds and Armenians.
And it seems like their alliance with Erdogan and the AKP party, back in 2018, that really emboldened them. It's almost like they're an unofficial arm of Turkish policy now, putting pressure on the diaspora to support Erdogan's agenda.
And there have been concerns about them infiltrating political parties in Europe. Like in Germany, for example, there's this guy, Zafer Toprak, who was a member of the CDU party, but also had ties to the Grey Wolves.
So they're operating at all these different levels, really.
Yeah. And then you have the clashes in Limburg, Belgium, in March 2024, where Turkish nationalists, some reportedly Grey Wolves, attacked Kurdish families. The Lemkin Institute actually condemned it.
Wow. Okay, so clearly they're causing a lot of problems.
Oh, yeah, Austria banned the wolf salute back in 2019. And the European Parliament, they've been urging the EU to add the Grey Wolves to their terrorist list since 2021. But it's tricky. Legally. Germany, for example, they've resisted a full ban, even though they have a huge Grey Wolves presence.
So it's a complicated situation.
Right.
Okay, let's switch gears one last time. What about the Russo-Ukrainian war? What about their involvement there? That seems a bit different, right? Because Turkey's officially neutral.
Yeah, Turkey's trying to play both sides a bit. They're supporting Ukraine, but they're also trying to stay on good terms with Russia. It's a delicate balance. The Grey Wolves, though, they're not neutral at all. They're very anti-Russian.
Right.
And there have been reports of them going to Ukraine to fight ever since the invasion in 2022.
So what's motivating them there?
Well, it's partly historical, right? That anti-Russian sentiment, it's a leftover from the Cold War. But it's also about solidarity with the Crimean Tatars. The Tatars, they've faced a lot of oppression under Russian rule, and the Grey Wolves see them as, like, Turkic brothers.
And they've been supporting the Crimean Tatars for a while, haven't they?
Oh, yeah, since the 90s at least. And their rhetoric against Russia really ramped up after Russia annexed Crimea in 2014. Protests, fundraising, all that.
Okay, so to bring it all together, what we see here is this pattern, these recurring connections between the Grey Wolves, Gladio, NATO, the CIA, and even organized crime. It's a product of the Cold War, of those proxy conflicts, and it involves some pretty shady dealings.
And it shows how important Turkey has always been, strategically speaking, even as the world has changed.
Yeah, and it's not just history, right? It's still playing out today.
Yeah.
We've got the tensions with Russia, the conflict with the Kurds, Turkey buying the S-400 missile system from Russia. It's all connected.
And those connections to criminal organizations, they didn't just disappear. They evolved. They're still operating, running drugs, trafficking weapons, the same stuff, just in a different form.
And I think this whole story, it's a cautionary tale.
Mm-hmm.
It shows what can happen when powerful people make secret deals, when they compromise their values for what they think is the greater good.
Right. The consequences, they can last for generations.
Absolutely. And the Grey Wolves, they're a perfect example of that. They're this mix of ultranationalism, Cold War politics, and criminal activity. And it's all tangled up together.
Yeah, they're essentially extremist proxies in the fight against communism, trained by the CIA, funded by the mafia.
Crazy.
And events like the Susurlux scandal, even the talk of possible links to the attempted assassination of the Pope, they give you a glimpse into how deep this whole thing goes.
So what can we learn from all of this? I mean, the legacy of this whole network, it's still alive today. In Turkey's deep state, in the actions of the Grey Wolves, and it's affecting Turkish politics. It's affecting Turkey's role in the world.
Yeah, it's a part of history that's still very much present, shaping events in ways that we might not even realize.
Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the world of the Grey Wolves. It's a complex story, but hopefully you have a better understanding of how it all fits together.
Yeah, and understanding this history, it's key to understanding what's going on in Turkey and the surrounding region today.
So one last thing for you to think about. How is it that these short-term alliances, these secret deals, how do they end up having such a huge impact? Decades later, we're still dealing with the fallout. And what does that say about the deals being made today? What are we not seeing that might come back to haunt us later on?
It's a question worth considering.
Absolutely. And if you're interested in learning more, we encourage you to check out the sources we used or do your own research. Until next time, this has been The Deep Dive.